Sister, a major issue of justice in Canada today revolves around the relationship between the Indigenous peoples communities in Canada, the Canadian government, and the Christian churches. And in our context, the Catholic Church is certainly a part of that. The Truth and Reconciliation report has come out, the calls to action are out, and the churches have responded to those statements. So when you look at the current climate of this dialogue, how would you assess it?
I think the climate is a positive one. I think that there's a genuine interest, at least at some level in the churches and in the general society, to respond to these calls to action. But I think a piece of the climate is that there's a climate of I would say, general lack of awareness of what the Truth and Reconciliation was really about, what its calls to action really are. They're calls to change the relationship that has developed over the years between Indigenous and non-Indigenous or settler Canadians. The Truth and Reconciliation identified the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, as the framework for a new relationship that we need to be about building. And that declaration is a very significant document that many Canadians know nothing about.
What does reconciliation mean to the Indigenous peoples of Canada?
I don't know if there's one answer to that question. I think one of the things that reconciliation means to the Indigenous peoples of Canada is the reconciliation between the kind of relationships that exist in the colonial era, that still exist today and through the process of colonization, and the kind of relationships on which this land was built. Those relationships initially were treaty relationships. A lot of Indigenous people are very clear that the treaties have not been honored. We have not been treated as sovereign nations, and that's what a treaty relationship is, a relationship between sovereign nations. So that's one of the calls for us to begin to respond to learn how to live as people who are in a treaty relationship, not as people who have conquered peoples who haven't actually been conquered.
Sister, when we watch the news today, oftentimes the news is very sad, the news that comes out of the various Indigenous communities. People suffering because of economic problems, some social problems, the numbers of suicides, for example, in some of the remote communities is devastating news. Now, the church obviously needs to be present for everybody in every community, but what do you see specifically as the Catholic Church's role today in the current situations that Indigenous peoples are facing?
I think part of the Catholic Church's role is the very role of being present, and that means being present not only in those dioceses where the majority of people are Indigenous, but also in the other dioceses of Canada where there are also Indigenous people in Indigenous communities. We identify the Indigenous peoples with the North. We say the bishops of the North have Indigenous peoples. A lot of the dioceses in the rest of Canada also have Indigenous peoples, and so there has to be the building of a new relationship in those dioceses as well. It's not that there's only one reality for Indigenous people in Canada. The majority are living in third world conditions in terms of the reserves and in many cases in the cities as well. So yes, Indigenous people in Canada are living in third world conditions, and we need to recognize that. The Church has a responsibility to make its parishioners conscious of that fact, to lead us into awareness so that we learn how to respond in a new relationship.
The very beginning of a journey that's going to probably last a long time.
Absolutely.
Sister, thanks very much for coming by.
You're very welcome. Thank you.